My topic is how data drives space economy and sustainability. And what you see on the slide here on the left-hand side are some questions, some thoughts, just to guide the conversation a bit. But I'm hoping that we can have some interaction in the chat as well. So as I proceed, you will see some poll questions, and I'll invite you to participate. And any questions that you may have, please leave them in Q&A box as well. So as Susan said, I'm Gunjan from GoEmerald. I have about 16, a little bit more than 16 years of experience in consulting. And the space focus that you see on the side here is a little bit new for me. And it's a passion that I've had ever since I was a child, which I never really knew what to do with until I had perspective from all these other industries to come back to it and add value to it with a data-driven focus. So that's what I'm hoping to share with you today. In addition to that, I'm working on a SaaS product now called Transform This, which is also focused on the space economy. So to kick off the conversation, I would love to learn a little bit more about the audience. And here's a quick poll question for you. If you can please use chat to input one of these numbers. What comes to mind when you hear space industry? So feel free to put in one of these numbers in the chat. So when you hear space industry, what comes to your mind first? Is it space? Is it rocket launches? Is it satellites? Is it research that happens most often with entities like NASA, ESA, or is it space flights? So I see something in the Q&A box. Oh, the chat is disabled. Okay, perhaps you could just use the Q&A box, if that's okay. Wonderful. So Shannon says 3, which is more research focused. And that's very common, right? And we'll talk about that in a second as well. So I know now the chat is disabled, but what is the industry that you're joining us from, if you're able to share? Okay, so Shannon is from consulting. Thank you. Another one, how familiar are you with the space economy? Do you work in the space sector? Are you an investor or an economist? You have some familiarity or you've never heard of it? I know people have heard of space industry, but not many people may have heard of space economy, which is a little bit subtle difference. Okay, wonderful. And one last one, what's your current role? Are you focused on data, business, technology, or other? Okay, business. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for participating. And coming back to the evolution a little bit, if I take a little bit of an overview, if you will, of space industry, 10 years ago, if I thought of what is space industry, these are some of the things I would think of based on the region that I'm from, right? So I grew up in India, so I would think of ISRO, but I would also think of NASA and ESA because they are really big entities that have the entire focus of their existence has been space exploration and supporting commercialization of space. So over the last little while, though, and you can see this chart is actually quite old. It's actually from 2016. There's been a lot of growth in the space industry in general. So you're seeing a lot of commercialized logos there, right? In launch vehicles, space tourism, you're seeing it in satellite subsystems, which is actually not that new of a field, but a very large and growing one. Then there are ground stations and value add services. And value add services have grown incrementally since that time as well. So when you think of it from this point of view, the other layer that comes on is the defense, right? So space, there's a lot of focus on um, keeping, using space rather to keep the Earth safe, using satellites to collect that data and just developing spacefaring technology that can provide a lot of this data to us commercially as well. And then there are a lot of stuff that's been going into space, right? So when you send stuff up there, that means that the data is growing around that stuff as well. So you're looking at some of the activities on this chart. And when you think of some of the more earthly industries, right? You think of banking, you think of retail, those are a little bit more, I would say, what I like to call at least a bit more mature industries where we've had the opportunity to collect a lot of data. We've had the opportunity to build a lot of models which are a bit more mature, and data quality, which we've had time to assess and address as well. Whereas in space, space is basically disruptive by nature, right? So there are certain markets, like when I look at satellites in space, maybe a little bit more mature than humans in space, right? So planned human missions to Mars, obviously a very new thing that nobody's ever done before. And there are companies like SpaceX that are working on building rockets which will take us to Mars. And then there are gateways that we're building around Moon as a layaway on the way to Mars. But these are all new things that we have not done before. So when you look at it from that point of view, and you look at it from either of business data or technology point of view, there's the conversation just changes completely in my point of view there. So data and model maturity is one thing, data volume is another thing. So anybody that's been listening to Andrew Ng probably knows he's been talking about the volume of data that may be needed to create models and AI solutions which we can leverage. Is big data necessary? In which use cases is it necessary? And how far does it take us? So when you look at this picture specifically, in the context of the polling questions that we did earlier, what would you say is the largest impact to data and data modeling? So if you could put the responses in the Q&A box as well. Is there one particular area do you think would have more impact in how data is being used or data field in general? No? So maybe I'll hazard a guess. So satellites is an obvious one, right? Satellites are also now entering the satellite cluster configurations. So that's not just transmitting data, but also possibly creating a network that can share data and possibly IoT solutions, right? So the conversation changes entirely when you look at it from that point of view. And when you look at gateways and habitats in space, then data use itself enters the equation as well. So currently, satellites may relay that data, transmit that data, they may even produce that data, but that data may not be used and transformed in space as much as it would be in future. So when you have satellite clusters and when you have gateways, there might be humans on that gateway that are actually leveraging that data, changing it and transmitting it back and forth with their colleagues on planet Earth. So it's becoming this whole new set of use cases which will take place. So when I think of space industry versus space economy includes, in my definition, a lot more other industries than just space industries that may be developing, let's say, the stuff that you see around planet Earth, right? So space industry might be like developing JWST or Hubble Space Telescope or even satellites, that's spacefaring technologies or spacefaring solutions. But space economy would include, for example, the supply chains or supply networks that are actually supporting that entire ecosystem, right? So I was having this conversation with somebody else earlier today. How do you then quantify the space economy in itself? So if somebody says, let's say cislunar economy is 2.7 trillion US dollars, is that really the right number? What's behind that? What data are we using to drive that conversation forward? So the entire conversation is quite new. Everybody has their own set of assumptions and their own take on it. And whether you are an investor or whether you work in one of those technology companies that's using that data to make decisions, it really depends on what perspective you bring to the table. And I find that it always helps to clarify that perspective ahead of the time. Okay. So as I said earlier, space is quite disruptive. So space is constant R&D and innovation. So once again, this chart's from 2018, quite old, but it gives you some idea of the total investment and some of the areas where the investment's going. So traditionally, it's been government that's been investing in it, and that has changed in recent years with private investments coming in, which we're hearing that this year that slowed down a little bit, but it hasn't stopped, right? So it slowed down because people now probably want to wait and see some return from the investments that they've already made and waiting to see how recession and some of this conversation pans out. But that doesn't mean that investment will stop. So if there's this much investment and there's this much R&D and innovation happening, that means a lot more data is being created, right? So when you have new data, that means you have new data sets. When you have new data sets, all of these conversations, the bullet points that you see on the slide, come into play. So is the data being generated quality data? Is it corroborated across various different organizations that might be undertaking similar type of research or similar innovation efforts, which traditionally would have been, government funded in a university type model, but with commercialization, somebody in India could be exploring the same use case as someone in US. So when you look at it from that point of view, how does that data and how does that particular innovation or R&D effort actually compare? Um, so the data quantity becomes another question as well. And when you build more on top of that, the model accuracy and model scalability, um, data is one thing, but what you want to do is accelerate that effort and build models on top of that to extrapolate it and take the conversation to future, right? By building AI solutions and automating a lot of these things that humans possibly can't even do when you look at space technology. So the only way to go into space is to have a lot of automation to scale that up. You're not going to sit there and manually trigger what a satellite should be doing in space. So what are the consequences of having some of those conversations, right? And when you look at it from that scalable point of view, sustainability automatically comes into play as well. Because if you have, let's say, a gateway that you're building in space, your ability to repair certain things if they go wrong may or may not exist in space, right? So some of the things in business models that we take for granted on planet Earth, you don't have that luxury in space. You need to build it to work day one, and you need to build it to be sustainable day one as well, because in low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit, there's only so much space that we have. So if something goes wrong, you may lose that entire investment, or the ability to fix it may cost a lot of money. So that's why sustainability is not an afterthought, like it often has been, unfortunately, for some of the industries on planet Earth, but it needs to be forefront. So sustainability actually needs to be pulled upfront to R&D and innovation initiatives when you're looking at space. And going back to these 4 bullet points, they are forming a foundation, if you will, to inform some of those decisions, right? Because during R&D, there's a lot of data, a lot of assumptions coming at you. Which way you go down, which path you follow, has certain amount of cost and certain consequences attached to that. So data forms a key foundation for a lot of that conversation. And then there's this other side of space, right? With obvious sustainable space definitions like removal of debris, right? That's a very obvious one that most people may be familiar with, even if you're not working in space industry. Everybody knows that when something breaks down in space, you can't just pick it up and throw it in garbage, right? There's no such thing as a garbage can in space. So removal of debris in orbit, something breaks down, it's just there. You need to actively take that step, and that's to me happening after the technology has been operationalized, right? So if something happened to a satellite after it's already in space, it's a little bit too late. So you need to think ahead and think about, how do I make sure that the failure points are low, and if a repair is required, then it's cost effective and it's easy to undertake. Then there are research and development efforts that are happening specifically around ensuring sustainability in space. Management of space traffic is another one, right? To avoid collision of objects in space, to make sure that there are proper tagging and tracking of items that are in our orbits. And then obviously data sharing is a big part of that. So anybody that's familiar with, for example, the Moon Treaty or the Artemis Accords, these are some of the initiatives that are forming foundations for these type of conversations, right? So NASA obviously has a big database that they publish online. But when you look at it from a commercial company's point of view, there's some guidelines that need to be put in place so that companies themselves are sharing that data across. And then, as I said earlier, in space economy, it's not just space industry, but other industries that will support that space industry in allowing these future technologies to head up into the space, for the gateways, for example, to be created for people to land on moon and stay there. There's a lot of supply chain that needs to be created. There are conversations around EV vehicles, for example, that could alleviate a lot of the traffic that we have on roads, to help get some of this material there. So how would this data help those industries, right? It's not just for the space community, it goes beyond that. And then you're looking at increasing number of types and space actors. So as I already shared, it's not just the space actors, but it's industries that go beyond that as well, with strengthening of the international cooperation. And the complexity of the space operations is another one. So that's where automation, AI solutions, even analytics to a certain extent will simplify decisions that human beings currently have to make manually. But if there's already an algorithm behind it, and if you can pull X amount of data to make those decisions with quality, with information that's available, then that obviously accelerates a lot of that conversation, right? But obviously, cleanup after the fact is a lot more costly. It's, as we know, on planet Earth already not really an option, not really something that you want to rely on. So you need to take an active approach in ensuring sustainability during R&D and during those innovation efforts. So as I mentioned earlier, with Transform This, that's something that we're working on in a SaaS product manner, where we're combining human intelligence with data and analytics to ensure that better decisions can be made during the R&D and innovation phases for some of these companies, not just in the space industry, but in the space economy, to look beyond just operationalizing a product and getting there as fast as possible, but accelerating that model with the thought process of, I need to also operationalize sustainability while I'm taking innovation from CapEx to OpEx, and how to use data to actually do that as we head to the moon. So if you're interested in Transform This, as I said, our goal is to enable repeatable, measurable, and sustainable innovation in the space economy. And there are two models that we're exploring in this manner. So first one is an open innovation model, in which everybody is welcome to participate. As you see from the chart, back in December of 2021, this is kind of the audience that we were able to capture. We did a lot of workshops in multiple different disruptive technologies at the intersection of those technologies, with data obviously being the foundation of a lot of that conversation, in bringing people together and discussing these problems that don't tend to have one solution or another, but a conversation is necessary to even identify how the R&D and innovation efforts should be shaped around those initiatives. And that really brings together people from outside quote unquote industries to have that ecosystem level point of view. So we've seen some success with that already, and now we're working towards a closed loop innovation solution in a SaaS platform as well. So if you're curious about any of these, we recommend that you come to our site and sign up, and we'll let you know about those open innovation initiatives. And if you would just like to have a conversation about the closed loop one, happy to have a private conversation about that as well. Now, as I said earlier, the humans going into space, the role of data is just completely changing, right? So in past, it's been more about enabling the GPS, the GSM, getting satellites in space and collecting data, even mapping various parts of Earth that we can't see while being on the planet to get that bird's eye overview, if you will, and collect that data and harness it and use it. So a lot of quote unquote Earth monitoring. But when you see the data center, the conversation about data centers going into space, and you see data being stored, transmitted, and shared in space, now you have data available and infrastructure available to do a lot more in space, right? So you may be able to do analytics in space, use that data directly in space. You may be able to form IoT and edge use cases in space, as I was saying earlier. The biggest IoT use case to me would be the gateway that's being built, right? So this picture that you see here is a perfect example of an IoT use case. Even the Mars rover with the Ingenuity helicopter, to me, that's an IoT use case, even though it's two two components of technology, but they're talking to each other and they're having this conversation. And there's a certain amount of analytics that are taking place. There's a certain amount of data transmitting that's taking place between those two components, and you times that by 100,000, and then you go back to that picture I showed you earlier with so many different commercial partners operating in space all at the same time. It's not like being on planet Earth where you can coordinate traffic with red lights, right? So data needs to be used in very smart ways between here and, let's say, Mars when that traffic increases. Some of that conversation, some of that planning starts now to make sure that that would be a sustainable solution. Then there's this other conversation about security and privacy, right? So maybe privacy isn't really that much of a priority currently in space because you don't yet have as many humans in space. So there's not that much private data, but you are doing Earth monitoring, and satellites are now sending up clusters, right? So when there's clusters upon clusters of various satellites and they're all in interchangeable orbits, what happens to the security from a data point of view? Um, and then there's this conversation about deep space net, and there's multiple names for that, so I put that in quotes, but basically an internet in space. So you can't always have the luxury of bouncing signals back and forth from transmitters on planet Earth. So you would have to then set up a whole ecosystem and an infrastructure for the technology to be successful and not fail, right? You don't want to leave someone stranded on the moon. So what type of infrastructure would it take to support that human being on the moon? That's a whole conversation as well. And data has a whole new part to play in that. So I know this was a very high level conversation. I didn't really dive deep into data sets, the quality of data in those data sets or even any models. But this conversation was meant to give you a high level overview of what is possible in space, how to begin to define sustainability in space, both from an operational point of view when you're operationalizing those technologies, but also when you're building out concepts for things like this Orion module, right? That would be working in tandem with the gateway to provide access to moon landers. How would some of this conversation shape, and what's the true role of data, both within those use cases, but across those use cases as well? Because we so much take that for granted on planet Earth, because a lot of us in our careers see that in one industry or another, and that infrastructure, for better or for worse, is kind of there. So how would it be in space when you first go there and you set up that infrastructure and you have to start from basically minus 10 and bring it up to a usable point of view?